You can't do that. This is a violation of HOA regulations. Karen Whitmore screeched, her voice piercing through the calm suburban air like a fire alarm at 3 a.m. I stood there, leaning casually against the doorframe of my barn, sipping my coffee and pretending not to notice the clipboard she clutched like it was the Constitution itself. It wasn't even 9 a.m., and here she was, in full Karen glory. Oversized sunglasses, a visor that screamed, "I'm in charge," and an attitude so inflated it could have floated the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. Let me back up for a second. My name's Mike Thompson. To most people in this quiet little cul-de-sac, I'm just the guy who fixes old tractors and tinkers with rusty farm equipment in his barn. What they don't know is that I'm actually a DEA agent running an undercover operation out of that very barn. Yeah, I know, it sounds like something out of a bad TV procedural. But trust me, it's real. And it was going just fine until Karen decided to make my life her personal project. Karen wasn't just any HOA president. She was the HOA president. The kind who knew every single bylaw by heart and treated them like sacred scripture. She'd already fined one neighbor for having their trash cans out 5 minutes after pickup and threatened another with legal action for planting unauthorized hydrangeas. So when she zeroed in on my barn, I knew I was in for a ride. This structure, she continued, jabbing her pen toward my barn like it had personally offended her, is not compliant with HOA standards. It's an eyesore, and don't even get me started on the smell. Now, I'll admit the barn wasn't exactly a Pottery Barn catalog cover. It was old, weathered, and smelled faintly of hay and motor oil, because, it's a barn. But it was perfectly legal. I checked the HOA bylaws myself when I moved in. Section 14B clearly stated that outbuildings were permitted as long as they were more than 50 feet from the property line and used for agricultural or mechanical purposes. And that's exactly what I told Karen. Well, she sniffed, flipping through her clipboard like she was auditioning for Judge Judy. I'll have to review that myself, but I'm pretty sure this violates at least 3 regulations. Be my guest, I said with a shrug. You want coffee while you're at it? She didn't appreciate the sarcasm. Instead of taking me up on the coffee offer, or better yet, leaving, Karen decided to escalate things. She whipped out her phone and started snapping pictures of the barn from every angle, muttering about documentation and evidence. At one point, she even crouched down to get a close-up shot of what I can only assume was a perfectly innocent patch of dirt. Ma'am, I said finally, setting my coffee cup down on the hood of an old tractor parked nearby. I'm gonna have to ask you to leave my property. I have every right to be here, she snapped back. This is HOA business. Actually, I said, pulling out my own phone and opening up the HOA bylaws PDF, because yes, I'd saved it. Thank you very much. Section 3C says that HOA representatives need written permission from the homeowner to inspect private property. So unless you've got a warrant tucked away in that visor of yours. Her face turned redder than a stop sign at rush hour. You'll regret this, she hissed before storming off down my driveway. Her clipboard clutched so tightly I thought it might snap in half. I figured that would be the end of it. Karen would go home, stew over her perceived injustice for a while, and then move on to terrorizing someone else about their mailbox color or lawn height. But no, Karen wasn't done with me yet. Not by a long shot. About an hour later, as I was tinkering with an old engine inside the barn, I heard sirens. Not just one or two, several. For a split second, my heart stopped. Had something gone wrong with the operation? Had one of our suspects been tipped off? But then I stepped outside and saw Karen standing at the end of my driveway with her arms crossed and a triumphant smirk plastered across her face. You called 911? I asked incredulously as 2 police cruisers pulled up behind her. Yes, she said smugly. I told them you're running some kind of illegal operation out here. I stared at her for a moment, trying to decide if she was serious or if this was some kind of elaborate prank. Unfortunately for both of us, she was dead serious. The officers got out of their cars and approached me cautiously. Sir, one of them said, his hand resting on his holster just in case. We received a report about suspicious activity on this property. Suspicious activity? I repeated slowly, glancing over at Karen. Yes, she interjected before I could say anything else. There are chemicals in that barn, and machinery, and who knows what else. He's probably running some kind of drug lab. Now look, I'm not saying Karen watches too much TV, but Karen definitely watches too much TV. Ma'am, one of the officers said patiently, do you have any actual evidence? I don't need evidence, she snapped back. Just look at it. It's obvious. The officer sighed and turned back to me. Sir, he said again, clearly trying to keep things professional despite how ridiculous this whole situation was becoming. Do you mind if we take a look inside? I hesitated for half a second before nodding. Legally speaking, they didn't have probable cause, but letting them take a quick peek seemed easier than arguing about constitutional rights in front of Karen. Sure, I said finally, but just so we're clear, when you don't find anything illegal in there, she owes me an apology. Karen snorted derisively as if the very idea of her being wrong was too absurd to even consider. The officers followed me into the barn while Karen hovered outside like some kind of nosy vulture waiting for scraps. Inside were exactly what you'd expect. Tools hanging neatly on pegboards, shelves lined with cans of oil and grease, an old tractor engine sitting on a workbench mid-repair, and yes, a few bags of fertilizer stacked neatly in one corner, because apparently growing tomatoes is now grounds for suspicion. After about 5 minutes of poking around, and finding absolutely nothing incriminating, the officers thanked me for my cooperation and left without so much as writing up a report. Karen looked utterly flabbergasted as they drove away empty-handed. This isn't over, she shouted after them before turning back toward me with fire in her eyes. Oh, I said with an exaggerated yawn as I leaned casually against the doorframe again, because why not rub it in? I think it is. Now, let me tell you a little more about Karen Whitmore and this neighborhood I found myself in. You see, when I first moved here, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. Quiet cul-de-sac, big yards, friendly neighbors who waved but didn't ask too many questions. Perfect for someone in my line of work. I mean, if you're running an undercover DEA operation out of your barn, you don't exactly want to live somewhere with nosy neighbors or weekly block parties. But what I didn't account for was the HOA, or more specifically, Karen. Karen wasn't just the president of the HOA. She was the self-appointed queen of the entire neighborhood. She had this uncanny ability to sniff out even the smallest perceived violation of community standards. Trash cans left out too long? Karen was on it. Grass a little too tall? Karen would send you a passive-aggressive letter with a copy of the HOA bylaws attached. One guy down the street painted his front door red. Just red, nothing crazy. And Karen threatened to fine him because it wasn't on the approved color palette. And don't even get me started on her war against holiday decorations. Let's just say Christmas lights past January 1st were grounds for a full-blown HOA tribunal. Now, most people in the neighborhood just rolled their eyes and went along with it. They'd pay their fines, repaint their doors, and grumble about Karen under their breath. But me? Well, let's just say I've never been great at taking orders from people who have no actual authority over me. Plus, I had bigger things to worry about than whether my barn met Karen's aesthetic standards, like tracking down a cartel that was smuggling drugs across state lines. Still, I tried to keep a low profile when I first moved in. I figured as long as I mowed my lawn and kept my trash cans out of sight, Karen would leave me alone. And for a while, it worked. She seemed content to focus her energy on other neighbors, like poor Mrs. Jenkins down the street, who got a sternly worded letter because her bird feeder was attracting pests. But then one day, Karen noticed my barn. It started innocently enough. She walked by one morning while I was unloading some equipment and made a comment about how quaint it looked. I thanked her and thought that was the end of it. But then she started stopping by more often, always under the guise of just checking in. She'd ask questions like, "What do you keep in there?" Or, "Do you really need such a big barn?" At first, I played dumb and gave vague answers, but it didn't take long for her to start getting suspicious. See, Karen had this way of making everything sound like a federal offense. To her, my barn wasn't just a barn. It was an affront to the very fabric of our community. Never mind that it had been there long before I moved in or that it was perfectly legal according to the HOA bylaws. In Karen's mind, it was a problem that needed solving, and she was just the person to solve it. One day, she showed up with her clipboard and started measuring things, literally measuring things with one of those retractable tape measures contractors use. She claimed she was checking to see if my barn was within 50 feet of the property line. It was. Another time, she brought over a copy of the HOA bylaws and highlighted random sections that she thought might apply to me. Most of which didn't. But what really set her off was when she saw me unloading bags of fertilizer one afternoon. Now, any normal person would have assumed I was doing some gardening or maybe working on a landscaping project. But not Karen. No, Karen immediately jumped to the conclusion that I must be running some kind of illegal operation out of my barn. You know, she said with that smug little smile she always wore when she thought she'd caught someone breaking the rules. Fertilizer can be used to make explosives. I stared at her for a moment, trying to figure out if she was joking. She wasn't. Karen, I said finally. It's for my tomatoes. Well, she sniffed. We'll see about that. And that's when things really started to spiral out of control. Karen began showing up unannounced at all hours of the day, sometimes with other members of the HOA in tow, to inspect my property. She'd peer through the windows of my barn, which were covered, take pictures from every angle imaginable, and even tried to fly a drone over my backyard once. I may or may not have accidentally knocked it out of the sky with a well-aimed rock. She also started sending me letters, long-winded diatribes about how my barn was ruining property values and making the neighborhood look bad. Now, normally this kind of thing wouldn't bother me too much. After all, dealing with difficult people is part of my job description as a DEA agent. But Karen wasn't just difficult. She was relentless. And worse yet, her constant meddling was starting to interfere with my work. You see, what Karen didn't know, and what no one else in the neighborhood knew, is that my barn wasn't just full of old tractors and rusty tools. It was also full of surveillance equipment. Cameras, monitors, recording devices, the works, all part of an ongoing operation to track down a cartel that had been moving drugs through our area using farm supply stores as cover. So every time Karen barged onto my property or called 911, which she did more than once, it wasn't just annoying. It was potentially jeopardizing months' worth of work. And yet somehow, despite all her snooping and accusations, she never once stumbled across anything incriminating, which only seemed to make her more determined. At one point, she even tried to get other neighbors involved by organizing an emergency HOA meeting specifically about my barn. According to one neighbor who attended, and later filled me in, Karen spent 45 minutes ranting about how my barn was a blight on our community and might be harboring dangerous substances. When someone pointed out that there wasn't any actual evidence to support her claims, she dismissed them as being naive. By this point, most people in the neighborhood were starting to see through Karen's antics, and some were even rooting for me just because they were sick of her power trips. But none of that mattered to Karen. In her mind, she was on a crusade for justice, and nothing short of tearing down my barn would satisfy her. And honestly, part of me almost admired her persistence. Almost, but mostly, it just made me want to find new and creative ways to mess with her, which is exactly what I planned on doing next time she came around with that clipboard of hers. Because if there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I don't back down from a fight, especially not when it involves someone like Karen Whitmore. So here's where things really started to heat up. Karen, in all her clipboard-wielding glory, decided that my barn wasn't just an eyesore or a violation of some HOA bylaw she probably made up on the spot. It was now a full-blown community emergency. And when Karen declares something an emergency, you'd better believe she's going to treat it like she's leading FEMA into a disaster zone. It all started with a letter. Not just any letter, a certified letter. You know, the kind that requires you to sign for it at the post office, while the clerk gives you that look like, "What did you do?" I open it up and, surprise, surprise, it's from Karen. 3 pages long, single-spaced, and written in Comic Sans because of course it was Comic Sans. The gist of it was this. She was formally demanding that I tear down my barn within 30 days or face serious consequences. What kind of consequences? She didn't say, but knowing Karen, I figured it involved either a strongly worded Facebook post or an army of HOA board members showing up at my door with pitchforks. Now, I could have ignored the letter. Legally speaking, Karen didn't have a leg to stand on. My barn was fully compliant with the HOA bylaws, and I had the paperwork to prove it. But ignoring Karen is like ignoring a mosquito buzzing around your ear. It doesn't make her go away. It just makes her more determined to ruin your day. Sure enough, about a week later, Karen escalated things. She called for an emergency HOA meeting, her favorite weapon of choice, and made sure to plaster flyers about it all over the neighborhood. Urgent community meeting, they said in bold red letters. Topic: illegal structure at 112 Oakwood Drive. That would be my address. The meeting was held in the community center, a beige little building that smelled faintly of mildew and broken dreams. I showed up out of sheer curiosity, figuring it would be good for a laugh if nothing else. The place was packed. Apparently, Karen had managed to convince half the neighborhood that my barn was some kind of threat to public safety. People were whispering to each other, throwing me sideways glances like I was Walter White himself. Karen took the podium like she was about to deliver the State of the Union. She cleared her throat dramatically and launched into a speech that would have made a televangelist proud. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, clutching her clipboard like it was a holy relic. "We are gathered here today because our community is under threat." I almost choked on my coffee. "For months now," she continued, "I have been monitoring the situation at 112 Oakwood Drive." She said my address like it was Voldemort's name. "And what I have uncovered is deeply troubling." She paused for effect, scanning the room like she expected gasps or applause, or maybe someone fainting in shock. No one reacted. "First," she said, flipping through her clipboard as if she were about to drop some bombshell evidence, "there is the issue of fertilizer." "Oh no, fertilizer. Call Homeland Security. I have personally observed large quantities of fertilizer being delivered to this property," she said gravely. "And as we all know, fertilizer can be used for nefarious purposes." At this point, I couldn't help myself. I raised my hand. "Yes," Karen said sharply, clearly annoyed that someone had interrupted her performance. "Karen," I said as innocently as possible, "do you know what fertilizer is actually used for?" She blinked at me like I just asked her to explain quantum physics. "It's for growing plants," I said slowly, as if explaining it to a child. "You know, tomatoes, cucumbers, vegetables." The room erupted in laughter. Even some of Karen's staunchest supporters couldn't keep a straight face. But Karen wasn't deterred. "Be that as it may," she said loudly over the laughter, "there are other concerns. Oh boy, here we go. Second," she continued, flipping another page on her clipboard, "there is the issue of machinery." "Machinery? In a barn? Shocking. I have seen numerous pieces of heavy machinery being moved in and out of this structure," she said ominously. "And I ask you, what possible reason could someone have for needing so much machinery? Fixing tractors?" I offered helpfully. Karen ignored me. "And finally," she said dramatically, lowering her voice for maximum effect, "there is the issue of secrecy." Yes, secrecy. The ultimate crime in suburban America. "This structure has no windows," she declared as if revealing some dark conspiracy. "It does have windows. They're just covered because sunlight isn't great for surveillance equipment." What are they hiding in there? What don't they want us to see? By now, most people in the room were either rolling their eyes or checking their watches. But Karen wasn't finished yet. "I propose," she said with all the self-importance of someone who thinks they're about to win an Oscar, "that we take immediate action to address this threat." She went on to suggest everything from filing formal complaints with local authorities to hiring a private investigator to conduct surveillance on my property, which was ironic considering I was already conducting surveillance on them. When she finally wrapped up her speech and opened the floor for comments, I stood up. "Karen," I said calmly, "I appreciate your enthusiasm." I didn't. "But everything you've just said is completely baseless." She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. "My barn is fully compliant with HOA regulations," I continued. "It's more than 50 feet from the property line. It's used for mechanical purposes. And as far as I know, there's no rule against growing tomatoes or fixing tractors." The room murmured in agreement. "And as for your concerns about secrecy," I added with a smirk, Maybe I just value my privacy, which is something you might want to consider respecting. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. The meeting ended shortly after that. Not with a bang, but with an awkward shuffle as people realized they'd wasted their evening listening to Karen rant about fertilizer and machinery. As they filed out of the community center, several neighbors came up to me and apologized for getting caught up in her hysteria. One guy even offered me some tomato seeds as a peace offering. Karen stormed off without saying another word. But I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because if there's one thing Karen hates more than being wrong, it's being publicly humiliated. And after that meeting, she was out for blood, or at least whatever petty revenge she could cook up next. But here's the thing, if Karen wanted a fight, well then, she'd picked the wrong guy to mess with. You'd think that after the HOA meeting debacle, Karen would have taken the hint and backed off. Maybe gone home, poured herself a glass of boxed wine, and binge-watched one of those true crime shows she clearly thinks she's starring in. But no, Karen doesn't back off. Karen doubles down. And this time, she decided to bring in reinforcements. It started with a knock on my door at 7:30 in the morning, because apparently, Karen doesn't believe in sleeping in or respecting personal boundaries. I opened the door to find her standing there with two other HOA board members flanking her like some kind of suburban firing squad. One of them was Bob, a retired accountant who always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The other was Linda, who I'm pretty sure only joined the HOA because she thought it came with free snacks. "Good morning, Mike," Karen said in that overly sweet tone people use when they're about to ruin your day. "We're here to conduct an inspection of your property." I blinked at her, still half asleep and holding a cup of coffee that I hadn't even had a chance to sip yet. "An inspection?" I repeated. "For what?" "For compliance," Karen said, as if that explained anything. "Compliance with what?" I asked. "With the HOA bylaws," she said, holding up her ever-present clipboard like it was a badge. "We've had several complaints from concerned neighbors about your barn." "Let me guess," I said, taking a long sip of coffee just to annoy her. "Those complaints all came from you." Karen ignored that and gestured toward Bob and Linda. "As members of the HOA board, we have the authority to inspect any property within the community." "Actually," I said, setting my coffee down and crossing my arms. "You don't." Karen's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. "Excuse me? You don't have the authority to inspect private property without the homeowner's consent," I said, quoting directly from the HOA bylaws because yes, I'd memorized them by this point. Section 3C. All inspections must be pre-approved by the homeowner in writing. Karen's face turned redder than a stop sign. "Well," she huffed, clutching her clipboard tighter, "if you have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't have a problem letting us take a look." "Karen," I said with a sigh, "I'm not letting you or your little HOA SWAT team anywhere near my barn. Now if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do." And with that, I shut the door in her face. Now, most people would have taken that as a sign to let it go. But Karen? Oh no. Karen decided it was time to escalate things even further. Later that afternoon, as I was working in the barn, I heard the unmistakable sound of a drone buzzing overhead. I stepped outside just in time to see it hovering above my property like some kind of high-tech mosquito. "Are you kidding me?" I muttered under my breath. I followed the drone's flight path and sure enough, there was Karen standing on the sidewalk with her phone in hand, controlling it like she was piloting an F-16. When she saw me looking at her, she waved and gave me this smug little smile that made me want to throw something. So I did. Now before anyone gets upset. No, I didn't throw anything dangerous or illegal at the drone. Just a rock. A perfectly harmless rock that just so happened to hit its target dead on because apparently all those years of playing baseball as a kid finally paid off. The drone wobbled for a second before crashing into one of my tomato plants. Karen let out an indignant shriek and came running over like I just committed some kind of war crime. "You destroyed my drone," she yelled. "No," I said calmly as I picked up the now broken drone and handed it back to her. "Your drone destroyed my tomatoes." She looked like she was about to explode, but before she could say anything else, I added, "By the way, flying drones over private property without permission is illegal in this state." So maybe think twice before trying that again." Karen stormed off without another word, clutching her broken drone like it was a wounded animal. But of course, this wasn't enough to stop her. Oh no. The next day, she called 911 again. Now let me just say this. Calling 911 should be reserved for actual emergencies, like fires or medical issues or someone breaking into your house. Not for reporting your neighbor's perfectly legal barn because you don't like how it looks. But Karen? She called anyway. When the cops showed up at my door, again, they looked about as thrilled as I felt. "Let me guess," I said when I opened the door. "Karen called you." The officer sighed and nodded. "She said there's suspicious activity happening on your property." "Suspicious activity?" I repeated. "Like what?" "She mentioned fertilizer," he said awkwardly. I couldn't help but laugh. "Fertilizer? Seriously?" The officer shrugged helplessly. "Look, man, we're just doing our job." "All right," I said with a sigh. "Come on in." I led them into the barn and showed them exactly what they'd find every other time they'd been called out here. Tools hanging neatly on pegboards, shelves lined with cans of oil and grease, an old tractor engine sitting on a workbench mid-repair, and yes, a few bags of fertilizer stacked neatly in one corner because once again, tomatoes. After about 5 minutes of poking around, and finding absolutely nothing incriminating, the officers thanked me for my cooperation and left without so much as writing up a report. Karen was waiting for them outside like some kind of self-appointed neighborhood watch captain. "Well?" she demanded as they walked past her. "There's nothing illegal happening here," one of them said flatly before getting into his car and driving away. Karen looked absolutely flabbergasted, as if she couldn't comprehend how all her meddling had failed yet again. And honestly, watching her stand there sputtering while everyone else in the neighborhood started laughing at her might have been one of the most satisfying moments of my life so far. But knowing Karen, something told me this wasn't over yet. Alright, so after Karen's latest stunt with the cops and her drone reconnaissance mission, which, let's be honest, was less CIA covert op and more nosy neighbor with too much time on her hands, I figured she'd finally hit her limit. Surely, after being laughed at by half the neighborhood and having her drone turned into tomato mulch, she'd pack it in and find someone else to terrorize. Maybe she'd start a crusade against mailboxes that weren't regulation height or declare war on backyard trampolines. But no, Karen wasn't done. Karen was just warming up. The next phase of her master plan? Facebook. Oh yes, the HOA Facebook group, a place that was supposed to be used for things like lost pets and garage sale announcements, became Karen's personal soapbox. She started posting daily updates about my barn like she was breaking Watergate-level news. "Concerned neighbors," one post began, accompanied by a blurry photo of my barn taken from what I assume was her car window. "I regret to inform you that the illegal structure at 112 Oakwood Drive remains a serious threat to our community. Despite multiple attempts to address this issue through proper channels, the homeowner continues to evade accountability. Rest assured, I will not give up until justice is served." Justice? For what? Growing tomatoes? She even started tagging local officials in her posts, city council members, zoning inspectors, the mayor. At one point, she tagged the fire department with some nonsense about potential hazards. And because Karen has the persistence of a telemarketer who just won't hang up, she eventually got someone's attention. A junior zoning inspector named Todd who clearly didn't know what he was walking into. Todd showed up at my door one afternoon looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He had this defeated expression that screamed, "I'm only here because my boss made me come." And honestly, I felt bad for the guy. "Hi," he said awkwardly, holding a clipboard that looked suspiciously similar to Karen's. "I'm Todd from the zoning office. We got a complaint about your property." "Let me guess," I said as I leaned against the doorframe. "Karen?" Todd sighed and nodded. "Yeah. Figures," I said. "Come on in." I led Todd to the barn and gave him the grand tour. Tools, tractors, fertilizer, the usual suspects. He scribbled a few notes on his clipboard and nodded along as I explained how everything was perfectly legal and compliant with HOA regulations. "Honestly," Todd said after about 10 minutes of poking around, "this all looks fine to me." "Great," I said with a smile. "You want some tomatoes?" Todd laughed nervously but declined. As Todd was leaving, Karen appeared out of nowhere like some kind of suburban ninja. She marched up to him with her own clipboard in hand and immediately started rattling off accusations. "Did you see the machinery?" she demanded. "What about the chemicals? Did you check for hazardous materials?" Todd looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole. "Ma'am," he said as politely as possible, "everything here is compliant with local zoning laws." Karen's face turned so red I thought she might spontaneously combust. "Well," she sputtered, "I'll be filing an appeal." Todd mumbled something about how appeals don't apply to barns before practically sprinting back to his car. Now at this point, most people would have admitted defeat. But Karen? Oh no. Karen decided it was time to go nuclear. A few days later, I noticed something strange. Little orange flags popping up all over my yard. At first, I thought maybe someone was marking utility lines or planning construction nearby. But then I saw Karen standing on the sidewalk with yet another clipboard and realized what was happening. She'd hired a surveyor. That's right, Karen had shelled out actual money to hire a professional surveyor to measure my property lines and determine whether my barn violated setback requirements. Never mind that I'd already provided documentation proving it was more than 50 feet from the property line. Karen apparently needed confirmation from an expert. The surveyor, a middle-aged guy named Rick who looked like he'd seen it all, spent about an hour walking around my yard with his equipment while Karen hovered nearby like an overzealous hall monitor. When Rick finally finished his measurements, he handed me a copy of his report and said with a shrug, "Everything checks out." Karen snatched his report out of my hands so fast I thought she might sprain her wrist. "What do you mean everything checks out?" she demanded as she flipped through the pages. "I mean," Rick said patiently, "the barn is exactly where it's supposed to be." Karen looked like she'd just been told Santa Claus wasn't real. "Well," she huffed after a long pause, "I still think it's suspicious." Rick muttered something under his breath about how he wasn't paid enough for this nonsense before packing up his equipment and leaving. Now by this point, even Karen's most loyal supporters were starting to lose patience with her antics. The HOA Facebook group, which had once been filled with comments like, "We support you," and "Keep fighting," was now full of memes mocking her obsession with my barn. One particularly popular post featured a picture of Bigfoot standing next to a barn with the caption, "Karen's next investigation." But despite all this public humiliation, and despite multiple professionals telling her there was nothing illegal happening on my property, Karen refused to give up. She doubled down yet again by organizing another emergency HOA meeting, this time right outside my barn. That's right. She set up folding chairs in my driveway and invited half the neighborhood to come listen to her rant about fertilizer and machinery for what felt like hours. And honestly, by this point, I wasn't even mad anymore. I was impressed. Because if there's one thing you can say about Karen Whitmore, it's that she doesn't know when to quit. So there I was, standing in my driveway, watching Karen conduct her little HOA meeting like she was hosting a TED Talk on neighborhood safety. She had her clipboard, her folding chairs, and even a portable speaker system so she could make sure everyone within a 3-block radius could hear her rant about my barn. Honestly, it was kind of impressive. If she put this much effort into something productive, she probably could have solved world hunger by now. But Karen wasn't interested in solving world hunger. No, Karen was interested in taking me down. And as I stood there, sipping my coffee and leaning against the barn door, I realized something. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about Karen proving to everyone, herself included, that she was right, that she was the hero of this story, and I was the villain. And if there's one thing I've learned in my line of work, it's that people like Karen don't stop until they're forced to. Now, at this point, I'd had enough. Enough of the meetings, the Facebook posts, the drone surveillance, enough of Karen turning my perfectly legal barn into some kind of suburban conspiracy theory. So I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands. But not in the way you might think. See, I didn't want to just shut Karen down. I wanted to shut her up for good. And to do that, I needed a plan. Lucky for me, I had an ace up my sleeve. The DA. Now, obviously, I couldn't just call up my boss and say, "Hey, can you help me deal with my crazy neighbor?" But what I could do was use Karen's own paranoia against her. All it took was a few subtle changes around the barn. Nothing too obvious. just enough to make her think she'd stumbled onto something big. First, I installed a couple of fake security cameras outside the barn. You know, the ones that look real but don't actually record anything? Then I added a few no trespassing signs, and one that said, property monitored by federal authorities. That one really got under her skin. Next, I started leaving random boxes and barrels outside the barn labeled with things like hazardous materials and confidential. Of course, they were completely empty. Just props to feed into Karen's wild imagination. And let me tell you, it worked like a charm. Within hours of setting everything up, Karen was back in full-on investigation mode. She started pacing up and down the sidewalk in front of my house with her phone out, snapping pictures and muttering to herself like some kind of deranged paparazzo. At one point, she even tried to climb onto her husband's shoulders to get a better view over my fence, which ended exactly how you'd expect, with both of them falling into my rose bushes. But the real piece de resistance came when I planted a fake document in my trash can for Karen to discover. It was an old file folder labeled Operation Barnstormer, with a bunch of gibberish inside. Random numbers, fake names, and phrases like shipment arriving Tuesday and secure perimeter. It didn't mean anything, but it looked official enough to send Karen into a frenzy. Sure enough, the next morning I saw her digging through my trash with a pair of rubber gloves on. She found the folder within minutes and immediately ran back to her house clutching it like she'd just uncovered the Pentagon Papers. Now here's where things got interesting. Instead of calling 911 like she usually did, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. She contacted someone, or rather someones, who she thought could help her expose whatever imaginary crime ring she thought I was running. The cartel. Yes, you heard that right. Karen somehow managed to get in touch with actual members of an actual drug cartel because she thought they'd be interested in whatever nonsense she thought was happening in my barn. How did she do it? Honestly, I have no idea. Probably Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or something equally ridiculous. Anyway, once we found out what she was up to, and by we, I mean the DA, we decided to let her play herself right into our hands. See, what Karen didn't realize is that we'd been monitoring cartel activity in the area for months as part of an ongoing investigation. And thanks to her meddling, we now had a golden opportunity to catch them red-handed. So here's what we did. We set up a sting operation using Karen as bait. We let her think she was meeting with cartel members at my barn to exchange information about whatever imaginary crime ring she thought existed there. In reality, the cartel members were undercover agents posing as criminals, and they were more than happy to play along with Karen's delusions. The day of the sting operation arrived bright and early on a Saturday morning. The same day Karen had scheduled yet another emergency HOA meeting outside my barn, because apparently one public humiliation wasn't enough. As neighbors gathered around with their folding chairs and coffee cups ready for another round of Karen's greatest hits, we watched from inside as everything unfolded. Karen showed up right on time wearing what can only be described as her version of spy gear. Black leggings, a turtleneck sweater, in July, and sunglasses so big they covered half her face. She had her trusty clipboard tucked under one arm and looked more determined than ever. She approached our undercover agents with all the confidence in the world, completely unaware that every word she said was being recorded by hidden microphones planted around the property. "I've got everything you need," she whispered dramatically, as if anyone could hear us over the sound of lawnmowers and kids playing down the street. The agents played along perfectly, nodding seriously while pretending to examine her clipboard full of nonsense notes about fertilizer shipments and machinery schedules, which were clearly just made-up time scribbled in crayon. And then, well, then we made our move, before Karen even knew what hit her, or more accurately, who hit her. The DA swooped in from every direction like something out of an action movie. Helicopters overhead? Check. Tactical units storming through fences? Double check. Neighbors dropping their coffee cups mid-sip while screaming, "What is happening?" Triple check. Karen stood frozen amidst chaos unfolding around her own doing, as the DA agents swarmed my property like it was the set of a Michael Bay movie. Karen stood there frozen, her clipboard dangling from one hand and her jaw practically hitting the driveway. She looked like she couldn't decide whether to faint, scream, or demand that someone explain why her HOA meeting had turned into a full-blown federal raid. Honestly, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. The neighbors, meanwhile, were having the time of their lives. People were snapping pictures on their phones, whispering to each other like they were watching the season finale of their favorite drama. Bob from down the street actually brought out a lawn chair and a bag of popcorn. Linda, who'd been Karen's loyal sidekick up until this point, quietly slinked away into the crowd, pretending she didn't know her. Now, here's where things got really good. As Karen stood there trying to process what was happening, one of the undercover agents, still in character as a cartel member, turned to her and said, "So, you're the one who set this up?" Karen blinked at him like a deer caught in headlights. "What? No, I was just trying to help." "Help?" the agent said, raising an eyebrow. "You've been passing us information for weeks." And that's when Karen lost it. "No!" she shrieked, waving her clipboard in the air like it was some kind of magical shield. "I was trying to stop him. Him." She pointed at me with so much force I thought her finger might detach and fly across the yard. The agent didn't miss a beat. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "you've been working with us to coordinate this operation." Karen's face turned so red it looked like she might spontaneously combust. "No, that's not true. I'm the HOA president." "Exactly," the agent said with a smirk. "And you've been using your position to gather intel for us." By now, Karen was practically hyperventilating. I didn't know you were..." She stopped mid-sentence and looked around at the crowd of neighbors who were all staring at her like she just confessed to being an alien. And then came the piece de resistance. One of the DA agents walked up to Karen and handed her a pair of handcuffs. "Ma'am," he said in his most professional voice, "you're under arrest for obstruction of justice." Karen's eyes widened so much I thought they might pop out of her head. "Arrest? You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president." The agent didn't even blink. "Ma'am, your actions have interfered with a federal investigation." But, Karen stammered, looking around desperately for anyone, to back her up. But all she got were awkward glances and a few muffled laughs from the crowd. As they led Karen away in handcuffs, she kept shouting about how she was innocent and how this was all some big misunderstanding. And honestly, it was hard not to laugh, because after months of her meddling and drama, seeing her finally get what she deserved felt like poetic justice. Now, you might be wondering what happened next. Well, let me tell you, it was glorious. Karen ended up being charged with obstruction and had to spend a few days in county jail before being released on bail. The HOA board, now thoroughly embarrassed by Karen's antics, voted unanimously to remove her as president. Bob actually volunteered to take over the position just so he could make sure no one like Karen ever got elected again. As for me, well, my barn stayed exactly where it was, fertilizer bags and all, and my undercover operation continued without any more interruptions. The cartel members we'd been tracking were arrested thanks to Karen's accidental help, which I'll admit was kind of ironic, and our case wrapped up successfully. But here's the best part. As part of her sentence, Karen was ordered to complete 200 hours of community service. And guess where they sent her? That's right, a federal agricultural facility where she had to spend weeks cleaning barns and shoveling manure. Talk about karma. Meanwhile, the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief now that Karen was out of their hair. People started putting up Christmas lights without fear of fines and planting hydrangeas wherever they pleased. Someone even painted their front door bright purple just because they could. And me? Well, I decided it was time to celebrate my victory in style. I threw a barbecue in my backyard and invited everyone in the neighborhood, except Karen, obviously, and made sure to serve plenty of fresh tomatoes from my garden. Oh, and one last thing. Remember that HOA Facebook group Karen used as her personal soapbox? After she got arrested, someone changed its name to Karen Free Zone and replaced the profile picture with a photo of my barn. It was beautiful. So there you have it, the story of how one nosy neighbor learned the hard way that messing with people doesn't always end well. If there's one lesson we can all take away from this, it's that sometimes revenge is best served with a side of humor, and maybe a few tomatoes for good measure. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed this story, and let's be honest, who wouldn't? Make sure to like this video, Share it with your friends who've dealt with their own Karens. Comment below about your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more ridiculous tales like this one. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.